$45,000. That's how much vanished when my hoe bulldozed the stone wall I'd spent 4 months crafting by hand and then blamed me when the hillside behind it crumbled into a muddy cascade. They showed up with heavy machinery, claimed it was a safety issue, and leveled everything I'd built in barely 2 hours. Later, I discovered someone had slipped the HOA president a payoff to clear my property for a private road development. And guess who ended up shouldering the blame for the whole disaster? This is where I tell the whole story, the corruption, the cover-up, and the moment everything started to fall apart. You're watching QA Story Essa, and this one might feel painfully familiar. My name's David Miller. I thought I'd found a little piece of heaven when I bought my home in Willowbrook. It sat on the side of a mountain, with a gently sloping yard that backed into a hillside dotted with ancient oaks and clusters of wild ferns. I've been a stone wall craftsman for over 2 decades as a trade passed down from my grandfather, who came over from Ireland. He taught me the old world method of gravity-fit stonework. So, when I saw water cutting channels into the slope every time it rained, I knew exactly what had to be done. My weekends blurred into hours of sweat and stone. I chose each rock not by rulebook, but by feel and instinct. That wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a legacy, a mountain retaining wall that curved naturally along the hill's contour. Every stone was placed not only for strength but for how it complemented its neighbors. When I finally set the last capstone, I stepped back and felt the deep, quiet pride that comes from building something both useful and lasting, as something that might stand longer than me, maybe even longer than my children. Then came Mrs. Evelyn Reed. One morning, as I stood admiring my finished work, she appeared, a clipboard in hand, expression fixed in a polite but unyielding glare. She looked like someone who'd been promoted to the job of saying number. Everything about her screamed small-time authority: sharp lipstick, crisp clothes, and the faintly forced smile of someone ready to issue bad news. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice dripping with that special blend of authority disguised as courtesy, "we have a problem with your property." Turns out the issue wasn't the wall, at least, not yet. It was my mailbox. Just a simple wooden post and a classic metal box stained brown to blend into the landscape. According to her, it wasn't on Willowbrook HOA's approved list of colors. She handed me a violation notice. $150 fine, printed on official letterhead that looked impressive until you realized you were being fined for choosing the wrong color. All mailboxes must be forest green, colonial blue, or antique white, she lectured, as if I'd broken some eternal rule of nature instead of picking a color that actually suited the property. I was stunned. Part of the reason I'd bought this house was to escape the kind of nitpicking I'd endured living in apartments, where every detail was controlled. And now, suddenly, a mailbox color made me an offender. But Mrs. Reed wasn't finished. As I stood there, still reeling, she turned her gaze toward my stone wall. Her look shifted from bureaucratic scolding to something colder, like a bird of prey spotting movement in the grass. "We're conducting a review of all structures in the community," she said, putting extra weight on all in a way that made my gut clench. "Some may need adjustments for compliance." Her tone made adjustments sound like mercy instead of an outright demand for demolition. She stepped closer, traced her hand along the capstones, and quietly snapped photos with her phone. "This wall wasn't approved by the Architectural Review Committee," she continued. "We'll need to check if it meets safety standards." My neighbor, Samuel Rodriguez, must have seen what was happening. He ambled over just as Mrs. Reed got back into her spotless white sedan, a car so clean it looked allergic to dirt. Samuel, in his 70s, had the calm, thoughtful air of a retired history teacher, someone used to explaining complicated things to teenagers who weren't listening. His hair was completely white, and he moved with slow, careful deliberation. "David," he said, glancing after Mrs. Reed's departing car with a troubled frown, "you hear about that new development on the west side? Hillrest Properties is buying up everything. Rumor is they'll need new roads." At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was too busy grappling with the idea that someone could just show up at my door and find me over a mailbox, or question a stone wall that anyone could see was built to professional standards. Yet, as I looked back at the wall, of months of weekends, years of skill, I felt a cold unease settle over me. Mrs. Reed hadn't really cared about the mailbox. Her attention to the wall felt more like someone scoping out a building before a break-in, mentally checking exits, making quiet plans. I repainted the mailbox the very next day, paid the fine, and hoped that would be the end of it. But the way she'd studied the wall made me feel like I'd been marketed, drawn into some larger scheme I couldn't yet see. Back then, I had no idea this was only the opening move in something far bigger, and far more calculated, than I ever imagined. Not long after, I spotted Charlotte Kim back on my property, this time with a man in a neon safety vest, clipboard in hand, pointing at different parts of my wall like he was planning an airstrike. Charlotte kept nodding along to everything he said, but her eyes betrayed her. She looked nervous, like she knew she was part of something she didn't fully agree with. For nearly an hour, they circled the wall, snapping photos from every angle while I watched from my kitchen window, feeling that knot of dread tighten in my chest. Then they planted a bright yellow sign right beside my wall, a hard-to-miss plastic notice, the kind you'd see taped to a condemned building or a fenced-off construction site. Bold black letters screamed, "Warning, unsafe structure, a address within 30 days." It felt like someone had stuck a scarlet letter on my property. I stepped outside to ask what this was about, but they were already piling into Charlotte's small sedan. She gave me a quick, apologetic wave that somehow made it worse, like she knew what they were doing was wrong but couldn't stop it. If this had truly been about safety, if they genuinely believed my wall might collapse and hurt so many, why did Charlotte look like she was silently asking for forgiveness? Samuel must have seen it all from across the street, because he shuffled over almost immediately, looking more worried than I'd ever seen him in the months I'd lived here. His usual calm had vanished, replaced by an anxious edge. He kept glancing back toward his own yard, as though wondering if his fence or shed might be next. "David," he began, voice low, "they pulled the same stunt on the Hendersons 6 months ago. Claimed their wooden fence was unsafe, forced them to tear it down, even though it had stood for over a decade without a problem. Now I'm hearing Hillrest Properties has been surveying the empty lot where that fence used to be." He paused, clearly connecting dots he wished weren't there. "Maybe I'm overthinking it," he added, forcing a small laugh that convinced neither of us. "But doesn't that seem a broken bar odd to you?" Later that afternoon, I found an envelope waiting for me in my brand new forest green mailbox, the one that had cost $200 to install to regulation standards. Inside was an emergency structural assessment from a company I'd never heard of, Save Structure Consulting LLC. The report spoke vaguely about soil movement and potential collapse, citing increased stress loads and imminent failure risk. But something felt off. There was no professional stamp, no license number, and when I tried calling the phone number, it rang to a dead line. I searched online, nothing. It was like the company didn't even exist. They'd given me 30 days to demolish the wall, or else they'd hire crews themselves and fine me $5,000 a day until it was gone. $5,000 a day for a wall that had survived pounding rain, mountain winds, and even a minor earthquake that rattled windows throughout the neighborhood without shifting a single stone. It all felt wrong, like a clumsy magic trick where you can tell you're being fooled, but you can't see exactly how. The more I dug, the clearer it became. This report was fake, so fake it was almost laughable. It wasn't even subtle, it seemed designed to scare someone into complying without asking too many questions. Or maybe it was attested to see if I'd fold under obvious pressure. That evening, I walked the length of my wall, running my hand across each stone. Everything was as solid as the day I finished it. No cracks, no sagging, nothing out of place. The report was nonsense. For a brief moment, staring at that obnoxious yellow warning sign in the fading light, I actually considered tearing it down myself. It would have been easier than fighting the HOA, the lawyers, the bureaucracy. Easier than the stress that was already starting to weigh on me. But then I remembered those 4 months of sweat-stained weekends, my grandfather's old-world techniques, and the pride I felt setting that final stone. This wasn't just a wall, it was part of my heritage, my craftsmanship, my mark on this small patch of earth I now called home. I wasn't tearing it down, not without real proof, not without a fight. So I decided to demand proper evidence, a real engineering report from licensed professionals whose names you could actually look up. But standing there, Looking at that glaring yellow sign and feeling the countdown clock ticking away, I knew whoever had orchestrated this wasn't planning to wait around for paperwork. They had a deadline, and my wall was in their way. A week later, the HOA announced an emergency meeting at the community center. Tuesday night, the place was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Word must have spread about my situation, because there were people there I'd never met before, all whispering, shooting glances at me like I was some kind of local controversy. The room felt electric, the air heavy with tension, as if everyone knew they were about to watch something significant unfold. At the front, Mrs. Reed sat behind a folding table, fingers drumming against her ever-present clipboard. Beside her, Charlotte fidgeted nervously with a stack of papers, glancing up at the crowd with the anxious look of someone who didn't want to be there. It felt less like a meeting and more like a trial, one where the verdict had already been written. Charlotte began her presentation, slides projected on a portable screen, dramatic red arrows pointing at my wall, words like gravitational stress and imminent collapse. She never once met my eyes. The photos they used had clearly been taken from far away, probably from the road or a neighbor's yard, and the arrows highlighted perfectly normal joints between stones, gaps that were supposed to be there, part of proper drainage and thermal expansion. Yet here they were, twisting them into something dangerous. She wouldn't look at me as she spoke. Her eyes stayed fixed on the slides or scanned the room, anywhere but at me. The technical language she used sounded impressive on the surface, but to anyone who had actually worked with stone, it was obvious she was just reciting from a script, probably written by someone whose closest experience with masonry was building a sandcastle. It looked official, and for anyone unfamiliar with the craft, it worked. Then Mrs. Reed took over. Her tone shifted immediately, confident, commanding, and somehow making my modest wall sound like a ticking bomb waiting to devastate the entire neighborhood. "You see, residents," she began, gesturing smoothly toward the projected photos, "we cannot and will not allow an uncontrolled structure to threaten our entire community. This isn't personal, this is about our duty to everyone who lives here, everyone who's chosen to make Willowbrook their home and who trusts us to keep them safe." She clicked to a slide showing nearby homes, each surrounded by dramatic red circles marking the so-called danger zones my wall supposedly created. "We have families with young children playing in these yards," she continued, "elderly residents who deserve to feel secure. It's our responsibility to act before tragedy strikes." She delivered it so smoothly, it sounded as though I'd intentionally built a death trap in my backyard, as though my only motive had been to endanger my neighbors for my own amusement. Reed had a gift. She could make reasonable people feel unreasonable, make you question your own judgment even when you knew you were right. I watched heads start to nod around the room. People who had probably never even noticed my wall, suddenly convinced it posed a mortal threat to their property and safety. I couldn't sit there and listen to it anymore. My hands were shaking as I stood up, anger and frustration boiling over. "Who wrote this?" I demanded. "Show me their license. How is this even legal? Am I crazy here?" My voice carried further than I meant, and the room fell completely silent. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, some sympathetic, others irritated that I was disrupting what they thought would be a neat, reassuring safety presentation. "I built this wall with traditional methods that have lasted centuries," I went on, louder than before. "No mortar, but stronger than any poured concrete wall in this whole neighborhood." Mrs. Reed turned to me, her smile calm and practiced, like she'd been waiting for this. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dripping with the patient condescension you'd use with a child throwing a tantrum in public, "I understand you're emotionally attached to your project, but personal feelings can't outweigh the safety of the community." She clicked to the next slide, displaying the fake-looking letterhead from Safe Structure Consulting, all official fonts and bold seals. "This report," she continued, "was prepared by independent experts using current engineering standards. Questioning the integrity of licensed professionals shows you may not fully grasp the serious liability issues at stake." The implication was crystal clear. I wasn't just wrong, I was irresponsible, dangerous, even. She turned my entirely reasonable demand for real proof into evidence of my stubbornness and recklessness. And it worked. I saw it in the audience. People who'd seemed willing to listen before now saw me as the problem, as if I was the reckless neighbor putting everyone else at risk out of pride. That's when Charlotte finally broke. After the meeting, while people were still milling around talking about community responsibility, she approached me in the parking lot, her eyes darting nervously. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Miller," she whispered, barely loud enough to hear, "I shouldn't be telling you this. If anyone finds out, I'll probably be off the board by tomorrow. But Mrs. Reed has been meeting privately with Hillrest Properties. They've been talking about clearing obstacles for a road expansion, projected deadlines and plans that have nothing to do with safety." I tried to keep my voice calm even as my heart pounded. "What obstacles?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Charlotte glanced back toward my house, where the top of my wall stood out in the glow of the streetlights. "They have maps," she said. "Detailed surveys and plans. The road they want goes straight through your hill, the right where your wall is now. Mrs. Reed calls it a community improvement opportunity. There's big funding involved." Before I could ask more, she turned and hurried to her car, leaving me standing there in the lot, her words echoing in my head. Reed would stall the decision just long enough to justify calling in a bulldozer. Driving home, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, I kept replaying what Charlotte had told me. Was it the truth, or was someone deliberately feeding me just enough to make me paranoid? Either way, it felt like my dispute over a stone wall had become part of something much bigger and far more ruthless than I'd imagined. The next day, I got a call from an unfamiliar local number. "David, this is Arthur Washington," the voice on the line said, calm and measured, with the authority of someone who'd spent years untangling complicated problems. "I'm a former member of the HOA board. We need to meet urgently. There are things you need to know about Evelyn Reed and Hillrest Properties, things that go far beyond what happened at that meeting." Arthur suggested we meet at a coffee shop across Tona, far from Willowbrook and, more importantly, out of earshot of anyone who might report back to the wrong people. Something in his voice told me this wasn't going to be a casual chat about neighborhood politics. Over coffee, Arthur spoke in a low, cautious tone, the way someone speaks when they've learned the hard way that walls really do have ears. "I quit the HOA board 8 months ago," he began. "I couldn't stomach what Evelyn was doing to people in this neighborhood. But before I left, I made sure to keep copies of everything." He slid a small USB drive across the table, like we were in some back alley spy movie, which, in a way, we were. What he showed me on his laptop made my stomach twist with anger and sick disbelief. Evelyn Reed wasn't just the HOA president, selflessly protecting the community. She was also on the payroll of Hillrest Properties, listed as a community development liaison with a consulting contract that paid her $50,000 for every successfully cleared development zone. The emails Arthur had saved painted a picture of systematic corruption stretching back over 2 years, property after property targeted for violations, owners pressured into costly repairs or forced to sell when the financial strain became too much. I saw a note that made my blood run cold. "Target property, Miller. Deadline, demolition in July, road in August." There was even a list of families who'd already been driven out this way. I recognized the name as of the Hendersons, the Williams family whose kids had that little playhouse. They were never safety hazards, they were just a broken bar in the way. Arthur leaned back, rubbing his forehead, exhaustion in every line of his face. "I tried to stop it," he said. "When I was on the board, I asked questions. I wanted to see real engineering reports, licensing, anything to prove these violations were legitimate. They pushed me out fast." Evelyn called an emergency vote of no confidence, said I was undermining community safety. He let out a short, bitter laugh at the sound of someone who's seen too much absurdity to find it funny anymore. Community safety, infrastructure improvements. What they really meant was, Hillrest wanted space, and I was in the way. Then Arthur showed me the bigger picture. Hillrest wasn't building a handful of homes, they were planning a sprawling luxury development with hundreds of units, retail shops, and recreational facilities that would completely reshape the neighborhood. The main problem? Access. The old road to the highway was too narrow and winding for the traffic they needed, so Hillrest had drawn up plans for a new, wider road cutting straight through the hillside behind my house. And my wall? It wasn't just a nuisance. It was the single largest obstacle to their schedule and budget. "Your hill's in their way," Arthur said quietly. They need it gone. He had documents to prove it, soil surveys, traffic studies, environmental reports, all carefully prepared by Hillrest, except for one thing, my wall. Working around it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and months of delays. Much cheaper, and faster, to bulldoze it. If you've followed stories like this, you know HOA corruption isn't exactly rare. Developers often use homeowner associations to clear obstacles and boost profits. But when it's your home, your craft, and your peace of mind on the chopping block, it hits different. Suddenly, everything made sense. The fake inspection report, the carefully orchestrated presentation, Charlotte's fear, and the neighbors being turned against me. It was never about safety, it was about getting rid of me quietly. Before anyone asked too many questions, Arthur handed me the files he'd saved, emails, financial statements, meeting notes, surveys, a proof of how deeply the board was entangled with Hillrest. Be careful, David, he warned. His voice was steady, but his expression told me this was deadly serious. They've invested too much to let one property owner derail them. Evelyn doesn't tolerate resistance, especially public resistance that might draw attention. And she has more influence than you might think. I sat there, wondering if it was already too late. Arthur had given me enough to blow the whole thing open, but would it be enough to save my wall? The answer came sooner than I expected. At 6 a.m. on Monday, I woke to the low, guttural roar of diesel engines vibrating through my bedroom walls. I jumped out of bed and looked outside. Trucks from Quick Demo Services were lined up like an invading army, a bulldozer, an excavator, a dump truck, and a crew cab full of workers already unloading barricades and tools. Not just one or two vehicles, but an entire demolition convoy. They'd brought a fleet for one stone wall. I threw on clothes and ran outside, phone in hand, recording everything. Some instinct told me I'd need evidence of what was about to happen. The crew chief stood at the front, a mountain of a man with sun-baked skin and arms like steel cables. His expression said it all. He didn't want this fight, but he wasn't here to negotiate. In my pajamas, heart pounding, I ran out and planted myself between the bulldozer and my mountain wall. "Stop," I shouted, phone raised to capture every second. "You're destroying private property. I have proof this inspection is fraudulent. The safety report is fake." The crew chief barely glanced at me. His voice was flat, almost bored, as though he'd heard the same desperate pleas dozens of times before. "File complaints with the court if you want," he said, not cruelly, just with the calm finality of someone who knew nothing I said would matter. "We just do the work. Orders say this wall comes down today. You can stand there yelling all you like, but it won't change that." Neighbors began gathering, some filming on their phones, but no one moved to help. Official-looking trucks and official-looking paperwork had a way of making even the angriest crowd hesitate. Samuel came running over in his robe, hair wild, panic on his face. "David, what the hell is going on?" he called, though it was obvious. "They claim they've got emergency orders from the HOA," I said. "Unsafe structures, immediate removal." The crowd grew, people in slippers clutching coffee mugs, teenagers recording like it was content for social media. Questions rose. Where's the paperwork? Why weren't homeowners notified? What right do you have to do this? But the demolition crew kept moving with practiced indifference, ignoring protests like gnats around their boots. Then she arrived. Evelyn Reed, perfectly dressed in a tailored suit, a small microphone in hand, her face cernia like this was a community picnic, not a demolition. Her smile made my skin crawl, calm, pleasant, and absolutely triumphant. "The residents can see that the HOA has always prioritized safety above all else," she announced, her voice carrying easily over the rumble of heavy machinery. "This wall posed a hidden danger to everyone in the area. We had to act decisively to prevent a possible tragedy." I wanted to scream, to drag her in front of my camera and force her to admit this had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with her partners at Hillrest. But arguing would only help her, feeding the narrative she was carefully constructing for anyone watching. So I filmed instead. The workers, the machines, the trucks, license plates, everything. Every stone that crashed to the ground felt like a piece of my soul being torn away. 4 months of back-breaking labor erased in 2 hours. What could I do? 2 days later, The first autumn storm hit Willowbrook hard. Sheets of rain pounded the hillside, flooding gutters, pooling in streets, exactly the kind of weather my retaining wall had been built to withstand. But the bulldozers had churned the slope into raw earth. No drainage, no erosion control, just exposed soil waiting to move. At 3 in the morning, I woke to a sound like rolling thunder that didn't stop. It kept growing, shaking the ground until I realized what I was hearing. The mountain behind my house was collapsing. I ran outside into darkness, rain lashing my face, and watched in horror as mud, rocks, and uprooted trees crashed down. By dawn, my yard was buried under tons of debris. Samuel's garage half collapsed under the weight. What had once been a green slope was now a scar of mud and stone. And then, as if summoned by the destruction she caused, Evelyn showed up again. Dry clothes, calm smile, microphone in hand. Cameras caught every word. "This tragic incident demonstrates exactly why we had to act," she said smoothly. The wall itself contributed to destabilizing the hillside. For a second, I almost laughed at the sheer audacity. She destroyed the one thing holding the slope together, then blamed me for the collapse. Like watching someone set fire to a house, then blaming the smoke alarm for going off. Standing there in ankle-deep mud, staring at what used to be my yard, I felt something colder than anger settle in my chest. This wasn't about a wall anymore. This was war. Staring at the wreckage, I realized I had a choice to make. I could cut my losses, move somewhere far away from corrupt HOA presidents and predatory developers and try to rebuild my life quietly. Or I could stay and fight, expose the truth about what really happened here, make them pay for what they'd donate to me, and to every other family they'd bullied into silence. What would you do if someone destroyed something you built with your own hands, then stood in the ruins and blamed you? Would you walk away and let them win or fight until the truth came out? Arthur introduced me to a property rights lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, a niche practice that, it turns out, is more common than you'd think. There are enough corrupt homeowner associations out there to keep lawyers like that busy full-time. We didn't need some marble lobby law firm, just someone sharp and fearless. Her name was Rebecca Martinez. Quiet, precise. Developers practically flinched when they heard her name. Rebecca understood something simple but vital. Facts alone don't matter. What matters is whether people see them. The key to everything was Charlotte, a board member caught between her fear of Evelyn Reed and the guilt gnawing at her conscience. Arthur and I had to convince her to do the right thing without pushing too hard, without making it feel like blackmail. We caught up to her one evening after a tense board meeting, under harsh parking lot lights that made everyone look exhausted and older than they really were. We laid out what Arthur had gathered: emails, financial records, development plans that matched the demolitions. Charlotte broke down. "I didn't know what I was signing," she whispered. "Evelyn rushed everything. I can't stay quiet anymore." Her confession opened the floodgates. Evelyn had rigged the board with fake experts, intimidation, and last-minute votes. Over the next 2 weeks, the evidence we gathered was damning. Videos from neighbors showing the demolition of my wall as stonework that was clearly professional, demolished with blatant disregard for proper procedure. Arthur uncovered emails proving Evelyn was in constant contact with Hillrest Properties about clearing obstacles on schedule. We found the money, too, a $50,000 consulting fee from Hillrest to Evelyn's personal account, deposited just weeks before my wall was flagged as unsafe. The so-called safety report: no licensed engineer, no physical address, just a P.O. box and a disconnected number. When people saw the footage of bulldozers, the flooding, the fake report, they finally understood. That moment when neighbors who doubted me suddenly realized I'd been telling the truth all along was indescribable. Messages started pouring in. Neighbors I barely knew said, "They measured our fence last month," or "They told us our deck was unsafe." Families who'd been forced out years before came forward with stories that matched ours almost exactly. Mrs. Henderson produced photos of her demolished fence and the survey stakes that popped up days later. It all led to the same pattern. Every unsafe property just happened to stand in the direct path of Hillrest's planned expansion. And every family forced to sell got offers from anonymous buyers later linked to Hillrest. Evelyn Reed tried to strike back with a press release calling me a disruptive resident endangering community safety, but it was too late. The story had already spread, Local news outlets picked it up, then regional ones. Willowbrook became a cautionary tale for anyone paying attention and a PR nightmare for Hillrest. We started hearing from journalists in other towns, and even from state legislators exploring HOA reform. It wasn't just about my wall anymore, so we decided to go bigger. We organized a community meeting titled "The Truth About Our HOA and Your Property Rights." We mailed invitations to every house in Willowbrook. We printed summaries of our evidence, copies of the most damning emails, financial records, the fake safety report. We invited local officials, journalists, and lawyers experienced in fighting similar corruption. Arthur's background in urban planning helped us frame everything in the language local governments understood, not just outrage, but clear evidence of systemic abuse. Rebecca shaped our presentation so it was legally bulletproof, focused on verifiable facts, not just emotion, ready to hold up in court if it came to that. She reminded us, this wasn't just about rebuilding a wall, it was about setting a precedent, showing that ordinary residents could stand up to institutional corruption and win. The night before the meeting, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I kept thinking about the families forced out, the homes lost, the quiet heartbreak hidden behind those sales signs, and I kept asking myself, would this be enough? Could we finally stop them? Property owners who'd been bullied into expensive repairs they couldn't afford, families who'd trusted their HOA to act in good faith, only to learn that trust had been sold off for someone else's profit. Would the community stand with me once they saw the evidence, or would they cling to Evelyn's version of events because it was easier than facing the painful truth that our own neighborhood association had been corrupted from the inside? Would people step up to challenge injustice, even if doing so meant conflict, discomfort, or risk? If you've ever been targeted by HOA abuse, you know the fear, the realization that having the truth on your side doesn't guarantee justice, that sometimes good people stay silent because speaking out takes courage they're not sure they have. The night of the public meeting, the community center overflowed. People lined the walls, brought folding chairs from home, even stood outside listening through the open doors. Willowbrook residents, city council members, local reporters, lawyers and activists from other neighborhoods who'd heard about our fight online and wanted to see if a community could really push back against institutional corruption. The energy in the room felt completely different from the tense, performative atmosphere of an HOA meeting. Instead of forced smiles and quiet dread, there was shared purpose and hope that, maybe, justice could actually happen. I began by showing video of building the mountain wall, explaining the traditional techniques, the months of careful work, and what it meant to me to create something that was both useful and beautiful. I spoke about my grandfather's legacy, the pride of building something lasting with your own hands, and how it felt to give something positive back to the neighborhood. Then I showed the demolition footage, the cold efficiency of the bulldozer ripping apart months of craftsmanship in Minnetonka, destroying something made to last, just to clear a path for profit. Gasps rippled through the room as tons of stone and earth collapsed into mud and ruin. People could see for themselves the devastation that never had to happen. Arthur stepped forward next. With his background in urban planning, he explained how the corruption had worked and why it mattered beyond just my wall. Calmly, methodically, he walked everyone through the emails between Evelyn and Hillrest Properties, each timestamp aligned with payment records and construction deadlines. He projected the bank statements, $50,000 deposited into Evelyn's personal account under the guise of a consulting fee. Just weeks before my wall was targeted, he showed the fake inspection reports with non-existent engineers and disconnected phone numbers, the development plans that neatly overlapped each demolished property. Then Arthur brought up the email that labeled my home target number 4, with a scheduled demolition that perfectly matched Hillrest's construction timeline. The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted in angry murmurs that built into open outrage. Arthur mapped out the 6 families forced out before me, each one standing directly in Hillrest's planned path. Faces in the audience shifted from surprise to recognition. Neighbors who'd moved away suddenly, families who disappeared from barbecues and block parties after receiving violation notices they couldn't fight. Seeing the pattern laid out like that, on a timeline with property maps, made the corruption undeniable. And then, from the back of the room, Charlotte stood up, Tears streaked her face, but her voice was clear enough to carry to every corner. "I want to apologize to everyone here," she began, voice trembling but steadying as she spoke, "and especially to the families hurt by decisions I helped make." She admitted she'd signed documents Evelyn gave her without reading carefully, without asking questions, without demanding to see the qualifications of the so-called experts. "I thought I was protecting our community," she said, "but I was really helping destroy homes and lives so a developer could get what they wanted." Charlotte's confession hit hard because it came from someone inside the boardroom, someone who'd watched it happen, who could confirm every detail. She described Evelyn's tactics: rushing votes, flooding board members with technical language, blocking real review by creating false urgency, and how the expert reports they relied on were fake, designed to intimidate and mislead. Most damning of all, Charlotte revealed that Evelyn had explicitly told the board their main responsibility was to facilitate beneficial development partnerships that would bring essential infrastructure improvements to the community. Language that made it painfully clear the HOA had been turned from a homeowner protection organization into a tool for developers. When Evelyn was finally given a chance to respond, her voice had lost its authority. "I only followed proper procedures as outlined in our governing documents," she protested, sounding more desperate than confident. "Everything was done according to established protocols and expert consultation, all to protect community safety and property values." But angry shouts drowned her out. Residents who'd been forced to demolish or alter their homes stood and shared their stories. People demanded to see the credentials of these so-called experts. Even some of Evelyn's former allies began asking about the payments from Hillrest Properties. When it came time to vote, nearly every hand in the room went up, even the ones that had stayed silent until then. Evelyn didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The result wasn't even close. 47 out of 52 residents voted to immediately remove her as HOA president and ban her from ever holding that position again. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her, almost, but then I remembered my wall, the mudslide, and all the families she'd driven out and the sympathy vanished. The community also voted to terminate all contracts with Hillrest Properties and to sue both the HOA and the developer for damages tied to fraudulent safety reports and corrupted decision-making. Arthur Washington was elected as interim president, tasked with rebuilding the HOA around new transparency requirements and resident oversight to prevent this from ever happening again. The legal consequences came quickly, thanks to Rebecca Martinez, who had been preparing our case for weeks, and because the evidence was overwhelming, the court ordered $45,000 in compensation for me, enough to rebuild my wall with proper engineering consultation, fix the property damage from the mudslide, and cover the emotional toll of seeing my work destroyed for profit. Samuel received $15,000 to repair his garage and landscaping. Evelyn Reed herself was fined $25,000 for breach of fiduciary duty and banned from serving on any HOA board in the state for 10 years. Hillrest Properties was fined $200,000, and their project was cancelled entirely. With the compensation, I hired a legitimate structural engineer to design a proper drainage system for the hillside. Then, I rebuilt the wall myself using the same traditional techniques, but with modern safety upgrades and official approvals from real experts. Arthur and Samuel helped me choose each stone, and this time, the whole neighborhood watched with pride as the wall rose, piece by piece. It took longer than before because we did everything by the book: inspections, documentation, and careful planning, but each stone felt like its own quiet victory against corruption and abuse of power. Now, sitting on my porch and looking at the new wall solid, approved, and standing firm, I've realized something important. Sometimes the fight finds you, not the other way around. You're just trying to build something meaningful, and suddenly you're forced to confront corruption bigger than anything you imagined. When someone tries to destroy what you've built with your own hands just to clear their path to profit, you have a choice: let it go and move on, or stand your ground and fight back with everything you have. The wall is stronger now, but more importantly, so is our community. We learned that corruption can't survive where people demand transparency, where residents are willing to ask hard questions and refuse easy answers, where neighbors choose courage over comfort. Does your HOA have its own Evelyn Reed, as someone ready to put outside interests ahead of your rights? If so, Now you know what signs to look for, and you know that ordinary people, working together, can fight back and actually win. The biggest battles sometimes happen right outside your back door, and sometimes justice really does prevail. If this story feels familiar, if you've ever gone up against a board, a system, or a neighbor with too much power, you're not alone. These things often stay hidden until someone decides to speak up. If you're dealing with something like this, share your story in the comments. And if you're new here, this is HOA Story, where the small fights matter, and quiet victories count. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. I hope it helped. I hope it landed where it needed to. Thanks for watching HOA Stories. If you enjoyed it, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more real homeowner stories every week. More wild tales are coming soon.